So welcome everybody. My name is Erin Mayo-Adam. I'm the director of the LGBTQ Policy Center at Roosevelt House and a professor of political science at Hunter College. And I'm delighted to introduce this evening's event, authors Paisley Currah and Zein Murib on their groundbreaking new books, Sex Is as Sex Does and Terms of Exclusion. These acclaimed new books deliver vital and urgent accounts of queer and transgender experiences of exclusion, both from outside the LGBTQ community and from within. For example, in Sex Is as Sex Does, Paisley Currah explores deeply flawed U.S. bureaucratic systems, showing why they fail transgender and non-binary people. Currah's insightful book was selected as a finalist for the Association of American Publishers Prose Awards in Government and Politics in 2023, and one of them's favorite LGBTQ plus books of 2022. According to the New York Review of Books, Sex Is as Sex Does draws urgent and surprising conclusions for transgender rights advocates, and indeed for anyone invested in a more just society in which states do not take an interest in our gender identities. In terms of exclusion, I said that right. In terms of exclusion, Zein Murib looks at the LGBT community in the U.S. as it formed into an identity-based social and political group. Murib argues that the strategic use of rightful citizenship claims, or the assertion that lesbians, gay men, bisexuals, and transgender people are owed rights as citizens, created opportunities for the recognition of white, gender non-normative, monogamously partnered gay men and lesbians at the expense of other community members. According to Susan Stryker, editor of the pioneering Transgender Studies Reader, Terms of Exclusion invites us to move beyond a liberal politics of inclusion towards a more fundamental sense of living fairly and freely amidst all our differences, and helps guide us towards that goal. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce you to both authors, Paisley Currah and Zein Murib, for what promises to be a very engaging event tonight. So I thought I'd say a little bit about both of them, and then after that we'll just jump into the event. I know that we have I think a couple dozen people who've also signed in online. We're going to have a Q&A at the end of the event. For those who are online, if you can use the Q&A feature on Zoom, we're going to have somebody who's going to monitor that, and we'll have an opportunity for you also to ask questions during the Q&A session. So before we jump in, a couple introductory words about our authors. First, we have Paisley Currah. Paisley is a professor of political science and women and gender studies at Brooklyn College and English at the CUNY Graduate Center. Currah has written widely on transgender issues, on topics such as discrimination, sex reclassification, and the transgender rights movement. An advocate for transgender rights at all levels of government, he was a founding member of the Transgender Law and Policy Institute, served as on the founding board of directors of Global Action for Trans Equality, and sat on the advisory board of Human Rights Watch's LGBT program. Zein Murib is an associate professor of political science at Fordham University Lincoln Center, specializing in the studies of race, sexuality, and transgender politics in the U.S., and their scholarship has been published in Politics and Gender, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Signs, Laws, and Politics Groups and Identities, as well as other peer-reviewed publications. And you can find their analyses of current efforts to criminalize transgender people in Teen Vogue, the Washington Post, and other media outlets as well. So we're really thrilled to have both of them with us for tonight's event. So what I thought we would do is I'm going to start with Paisley Currah, and then we'll move on to Zein Murib's book, and then I'll have a portion of the night where I'll put both of their books in conversation, and the last 15 minutes will be our author Q&A. All right? So we'll start with Paisley. Hello.
Hello.
So in the introduction, you explain that your book focuses on what sex is, not on what sex is, but instead on what sex does for the state and government bureaucracies. So can you explain for us what it means to focus on what sex does and why you decided to make this the focus of your book?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good question. When I started doing research on this topic, I was really kind of transfixed by this question that transgender people face, where the same person could have different sex classifications. Like I could be male at the DMV and female at the Social Security records, male for the purposes of homeless shelters, female for the purposes of jails. So I was like, how can one person have different legal sex classifications? And there was this contradiction. I was always thinking, there's got to be some master logic solving it. And so what does the state think sex is? But then, even though I think I'm smart and I got a PhD and I read a lot of books, I really figured it out only by working as an advocate, doing work with the New York City government, when a bunch of us were trying to get the city to change how it classified people on birth certificates. So for a long time, the city would give trans people a new birth certificate that had no box for gender. So the city formed a committee, and a bunch of us came down there. We're like, oh, we'll tell you what sex is. Sex is really gender identity, and here's a bunch of doctors, here's a bunch of medical people. You know, the only thing you should, the only way you should ever kind of classify sex is according to gender identity. That's the only fair way. So we were like presenting all these state-of-the-art arguments about what sex is. Like we were saying, sex is basically, we need to think of it as gender, and gender is basically gender identity. And long story short, you can read about it. This story was kind of excerpted in the New York Review of Books. After a couple years, the city was like, yeah, we're not going to change it like you wanted. We're not going to change it. We're going to just, make people have all the surgery, and then we'll give them a new birth certificate, which was very conservative. But looking through the reports and the documents from the city, when I started to get access to them, I realized these bureaucrats, they didn't really care what sex is. They cared about what it does. And so they had shopped around our lovely, beautiful proposal about gender identity to all these different city agencies, and every agency had a different answer to how they should define sex. And I realized, like, the contradictions that an individual has in terms of their sex classification is based on, like, there's no one state. There's all these different state actors that do different things. So DMVs do different things than birth certificates, than marriage when there's bans on same-sex marriage. And that led me to this kind of the penny dropping of like, oh, it's not really what sex is that they care about, it's what sex does.
Thank you. So let's dive into these sex classification systems. Your book talks a lot about the obstacles that transgender people face when they, as byproducts of these sex classification systems at work in government agencies. So why did these emerge, and what are just some examples of the harms that they've placed on transgender people? I will say this is one of the things I really love about your book is you do this excellent job sort of combining theory with just real experiences that people have gone through.
Yeah, so, as someone who was doing research on sex classification, but also someone who was transgender and trying to change my own documents, I always assumed when there was a bad policy, it's because the policy was transphobic. Like they're being mean to transgender people. And certainly a lot of policies had bad transphobic effects. But what I realized was that we had this sex classification system baked into all these different parts of government because it was originally there to make sure that men got more stuff than women for the most part. So even as like sex gets kind of decommissioned over the course of the 20th century, in the sense of like the state isn't supposed to treat men and women differently, still every agency has has sex classification built into it. So in one sense, the harm in one sense the harm was sort of a byproduct of misogyny and sexism, and then over time it becomes the harms get more kind of complicated, and sometimes the good things were happening. So for example, the DMVs would be like, oh, New York State would let you change your driver's license very easily with a letter from a doctor saying this person is basically a man or this person's a woman. We didn't have to have any kind of medical intervention. And that seemed good. And I thought, oh, that's a non-transphobic policy. They like transgender people. And like a lot of DMVs all over the country were like good like that. And a friend of mine who is a lawyer doing transgender legal advocacy, he actually went. Of course, you don't really think about it till you realize. The DMV people have their own annual conference. Everybody does? They have their own. He went to their annual conference. Yes, you want to go. I'm sure it's going to be so fun. And I was like, he came back from the conference and was like, Chris, what's with the DMV people? Are they all trans? Are they all like, what's going on? And he was like, no, I wasn't picking up on a lot of good vibes. They didn't seem that bad, but they just seemed like bureaucrats. And then I was also studying like all these cases where trans people were lost in terms of marriage. So a trans person would be married to to a non-trans person and what they to them was an opposite-sex marriage back before there was marriage equality. And these trans people had changed their every identity document, done all the things, and then a court would say, yeah, but the purposes of marriage, your sex is assigned at birth. So I was trying to figure that out, and then I realized, like, oh yeah, so like, the DMV is not being nice to me because they're not transphobic. The DMV is letting me change my identity document because it's in the state's interest in terms of its role in surveilling people and tracking individuals going around for me to carry an identity document that reflects my gender. That's why they're being nice to trans people. But when it comes to marriage, trans people's existence in marriage and all these disputes around custody and property and inheritance, trans people kind of mess up the myth of marriage, that is, and the myth of the family. Like, young people might think that marriage is about, people falling in love, but we all know that it's like the legal instrument to, to guarantee the transmission of property. So trans people would kind of mess up marriage because the fiction of families as biological entities would be sort of undone by the existence of trans people. So I realized that seeing the harms that happen to transgender people as results of transphobia is too simple. Like, it's not a good analytical frame. We need to kind of understand at a much deeper level what states are doing.
So getting to that deeper level, I thought we'd turn next to the way your book tackles trans rights movement discourse. So one of the main arguments in your book is that trans rights discourse on non-discrimination and inclusion resonates with neoliberalism, and as a result, in many cases, the transgender, cisgender binary this discourse perpetuates obscures more than it reveals. And I really found this argument fascinating. Can you explain for our audience how trans rights discourse can be problematic and can obfuscate deeper systemic issues around race, gender, and class?
Yeah, totally. And I'm sure Zein and we can talk about this more when we get into the discussion of identity politics. But this kind of, I worked through this argument about neoliberalism, which is, like the academics' word for capitalism with some new twists on it. And looking at like the trans rights advocacy groups' approaches to prisons. So what I noticed was like mainstream trans rights advocates weren't saying, oh, prisons are bad. They were saying like, because there's discrimination against transgender people end up doing illegal things and end up going to jail. But we weren't contesting the very existence of jail. We weren't making any kind of abolitionist discourse. And the discourse was all like, trans people can be and want to be good, productive, employable citizens. And how can we do that? So I was noticing that kind of unsurprisingly neoliberal discourse. And then the other thing I was noticing in terms of people doing advocacy for trans prisoners is that trans prisoners were compared to cisgender prisoners. So and it's true, transgender prisoners, there are some studies from California, are like 13 times more likely to experience sexual assault and harassment. Like, so the situation is not good, and trans prisoners are often denied gender-affirming care. But it became, I think maybe the apotheosis of this was giving a talk about Middlebury, and some person stood up and talked about their danger of being incarcerated because they're trans. And I was looking at this person thinking, your danger is getting hired by Goldman Sachs. That is what you're vulnerable to. Like, you're not a black trans woman from California. Like, you saying we and going to prison kind of is like, kind of using this kind of transgender category to suggest that all transgender people are equally vulnerable to incarceration. And that sort of like masks over all these really trenchant big differences based on race and class and economic vulnerability. And I think the thing that got me the most was when Dee Farmer, who was the first person to have a trans case before the Supreme Court. A lot of the trans advocates don't talk about her much because it was a prison case, but she had an 8th Amendment case way back in the late 1980s, I think. And she spoke to my class, and she does all this advocacy for prisoners right now. She's not doing advocacy for transgender prisoners per se, she's doing advocacy for all prisoners. And what she points out is like, trans prisoners don't get the care they need, but neither do cisgender prisoners. So cisgender prisoners have cancer and they get Advil. Transgender people need gender-affirming care, we get Advil. So like comparing trans to cisgender prisoners is actually kind of masking the larger problem of what's going on with prisons. And it suggests that like trans people who are incarcerated and trans people who are not incarcerated have a lot of commonalities. And I think that's kind of what got me to the kind of thinking about like this trans-cis distinction is like, and sometimes a little problematic.
Oh, thank you for that. So the last question I wanted to ask you comes from your conclusion. So your book ends by describing a gender pluralist politics. Can you explain what a gender pluralist politics looks like, and what is gained and what is lost by this approach.
Yeah, so I'm all for gender pluralism. Like, I think it's a good idea. And the idea being like, I think of it like religious pluralism, right? Like, the state shouldn't have any investment in any one particular religion. So religion should be disestablished. And so gender should be like that, right? The state shouldn't have any interest in any particular gender and or way of being gendered. And the state shouldn't like demand that your assigned sex at birth match your gender identity, match your identity documents. Like, people should be able to kind of flourish in whichever kind of gendered way they want to live, right? So that's a certain kind of gender pluralism, and we could take that further and think about gender abolition. I just taught in my feminist theory class about gender abolition today. So I think that's a good thing, but and Facebook having 57 gender categories, I'm not against that. But what I think we need to remember, though, is that even though the state has retreated from its formal, that's what political scientists say, from like treating men and women differently based on their gender, there still is like pervasive gender inequity in our society, from the amount of care work that women do, unpaid care work, sexual harassment, rape, all these things which are also racialized. So like we are still in a system of gender asymmetry. So we need, as we move towards gender pluralism or even discourses of gender abolitionism, we need to not let go of these fights that still have to happen in terms of like making sure that resources are distributed equitably to people. And so, because women are still suffering under capitalism.
So thank you so much for that. We'll return when we do a conversation between both books. So I thought now we'd move on to Zein's book. Zein, I really loved your book as well. It was very clearly written, and I thought it was actually a really important historical intervention, really bringing to light a lot of things about gender and identity formation that we've sort of just not really paid attention to with the formation of the LGBTQ rights movement. So in particular, your book shows how intersectionally marginalized people within the LGBTQ community, like queer and trans undocumented people, for example, are erased from the LGBT movement through something called Rightful Citizenship Claiming. So can you tell us about how this process unfolds and why it's so troubling?
Yeah, and so thank you for the invitation to speak with you all, and thank you for showing up on is it a Tuesday night? Yeah, excellent. And the online audience too. So the first step in defining rightful citizenship claims is thinking about what it is that movements do as a regular practice. So oftentimes what happens is marginalized groups go to their audiences, it could be Congress, it could be a judge, and they say that were it not for this difference that I have, I would be afforded or entitled to certain rights as a citizen. And so an example from the mainstream gay and lesbian movement is the push to be able to serve openly in the military. So the argument went, I should have the right to do this, citizenship practice, claim this right as a gay and lesbian person, and I would be entitled to this if it weren't for that difference. And the problem with that is that those claims require asserting that you are, in fact, at a basic level, a citizen. And here I'm thinking about citizenship as both a legal status, but also as this, T.H. Marshall talks about citizenship also as a highly symbolic status. And so we all know from living in our social worlds that not everybody enjoys the same citizenship rights. And I think that's, Paisley, your comments at the end there is where we get, right? And so what happens is that the only people who are brought over the finish line are those who are closest to the prototypical rights-bearing subject. And I love that we're in the Roosevelt room because the prototypical rights-bearing subject, the recipient of human rights, is typically those who are closest to the white, non-trans, land-owning, depending on how far back you go, men. So that is what I argue throughout the book, which is, this is a strategic claim that often brings success for movements, but only for certain segments of the movements. And it also requires that alternative strategies, and so namely I'm thinking here of radical approaches that are identifying dominant ideologies, looking to upend systems of oppression, get portrayed as unsophisticated or not logical, or, and in most cases what we see is violent, right? And so it creates this bifurcated understanding of politics through the focus on rights.
Thank you for that. One of the things I also like about your book is you show how these rightful citizenship claims are employed in ways to construct exclusive identity categories. And I thought you made a really compelling case of this in particular on your chapter on lesbian identity. In this chapter, you show how Black lesbian feminists actively resisted the biological determinism that characterized many white lesbian feminists in the mid to late 20th century. So how have these exclusive understandings of identity and rights carried through to today, and have they changed, particularly amongst younger generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer is yes and no. So a really good example of this is thinking about fights over abortion, particularly since the Supreme Court repealed Roe. And basically what happened is that a very vocal segment of the feminist movement made the argument that if it weren't for all of this attention that was being paid to trans people, in particular trans women, then attention wouldn't be taken away from reproductive rights access. And I argue, or I'm thinking about this in relation to the book, this is a zero-sum version of politics. In other words, what I get necessarily requires taking something away from you. And this is, I think, fostered by a focus on rights, because rights in a liberal tradition are seen primarily as mapping onto people's identities or subject positions along a single axis, right? So you claim discrimination on the basis of your gender, you claim discrimination on the basis of your race. The intersectional intervention is to say, well, what if we, take one step further and say that liberalism is actually the problem, right? Or capitalism or neoliberalism in Paisley's work. In going back to the abortion example, what happens is you get this very distinct, in the 70s, this anti-trans brand of feminism that I think has really, it's resonated through to today's politics. And so we have more fracturing of movements where we should actually be working together. Because at the end of the day, the fight over abortion access or the fight over being able to access gender-affirming care is about bodily autonomy. And so those groups actually have more in common than not. And so going back to the Black lesbian interventions, it's the 1970s, and so it's very much about women's liberation and thinking about oneself as a woman. But what I'm able to show in the analysis that I do in the book is that Black lesbian feminists were coming at this with a much more flexible analytic approach to gender than a lot of the mainstream white lesbian movement. That was very much about securing their access to rights through this claim that they were being oppressed specifically as women and women only.
Great. So I don't want to fully leave the identity category discussion yet. We've held a number of events at the Roosevelt House where speakers have discussed LGBT versus queer identity. And I have to be honest, this is also something that comes up in a lot of my classes because the way queer identity has changed is just really fascinating since the 1990s. And you take up queer identity formation in chapter 6. So can you tell us, explain for us how LGBT and queer identities are, how they're linked identity groups that formed through the movement politics of the 1990s, and then maybe how have they changed today?
Yeah, this is a great question. So in chapter 6 of the book, what I have, this is like great thing that happens when you're doing research. So my book is based primarily on archival evidence, and I stumbled across these archived transcripts of these meetings called the National Policy Roundtables that were held in the late 1990s and early 2000s. They ended after September 11th, 2001, as far as in terms of the archival record. And these are verbatim transcripts of the meetings that were being held amongst different executive directors and movement leaders who represented lesbian, gay, bisexual, and or transgender groups. And what was happening there is they were talking about how to form a unified movement in the face of the conservative ascendancy in American politics at that time, so the election of George Bush and things like that. But they were also really concerned with trying to understand how to navigate the diversity of those groups. And so it was diversity at different levels. It was across the LGBT initialism, but also racial diversity, diversity in terms of sexual practices, gender, all of these different things. And so they borrowed from academic queer theory, which was at the time understood as this anti-normative, We can think about it as an analysis of power in different ways. So there's the anti-normative Michael Warner, and then there's the relationship to power from Kathy Cohen, thinking about it as something that is at its core anti-normative. And so they used that language of queer in these meetings to talk about racial difference and say, if you were interested in political goals that map onto what it is that we're concerned with, so prison abolition, the decriminalization of sex work, disrupting these constraining frameworks like marriage and monogamy and these different things, then you can think of yourself as queer. And we'll leave the electoral politics, we'll leave the rights, getting to serve in the military, to this evolving LGBT group. But I think what I show in the final chapter is that they require each other in order for coherence. So to be queer is to be in opposition to LGBT, and to be LGBT is to be outside of that queer designation. That was then. I think now we have a lot of people who identify themselves as queer that I would say in this 1990s framework aren't necessarily queer, and I'm curious to know. I think this is an open question. I think it's an empirical question. Every year I get different answers from my students about what queer means to them. Sometimes they say that is a bad, pejorative term, and other times I hear them talking about it very proudly. And so I think that is always evolving. That's one of the cool things, is language is always changing. And so I don't have an answer for the latter part of your question, but that's a little bit of the history from the movement perspective.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the last question I want to ask you is also about your conclusion. So your conclusion posits several ways we might think outside of rightful citizenship claims. So how might we prevent or combat the exclusions employed by this type of politics?
Yeah, so in the book, I use intersectionality and Black feminist thinking to argue that part of the problem that is set in motion by rights claims is this top-down approach to political mobilizing. So in other words, I'm able to show that movement actors at the national level were dictating this rights-based agenda, and that they were actually they knew that they were leaving people behind. And the way that they knew that they were leaving people behind is those people were in the room, and they were saying, hey, if you focus on rights, you're leaving us behind. And they did it anyway. And so I argue in the conclusion that a different form of political praxis might think of grassroots political action, or going to people who are most affected or most precarious and asking them what they want or need. And so I was thinking about this morning, and I don't want to say that this is an exclusive list, but let's say that trans youth at this moment and undocumented people are the most precarious in our social and political order. Political praxis that I'm advocating for would go to those groups and ask them what they need, so that again, it would be not top down, but bottom up. But then I think that we also would be well served to think outside of the frame of identity, and I think that this is where our books are in conversation with each other, and thinking more in terms of ideologies that cause harm to groups. So capitalism is a big one, obviously, neoliberalism, cisnormativity, heteronormativity, homonormativity, white supremacy, and organizing in those ways to combat those oppressive systems, because again, that brings more people together. When I talk about this with students, it's like, power is over here, and there's a few people who are close to power, but the rest of us are over here. So what would it look like if we came together and realized that we are working in relation to power in these different ways to move the ball forward?
So that's actually a perfect segue into my general questions for both of you, because my first question was going to ask you both to dive into identity politics a little bit. So both of your books grapple with transgender identity in different ways. So Paisley, you show how the transgender cisgender binary obscures larger social problems, as you've already talked about. And Zein, you show how the formation of transgender identity through rightful citizenship claims has excluded the most marginalized people from within the trans community, like gender nonconforming people, trans people of color, and people who are poor and homeless. So why is it that this type of exclusive identity politics seems to be such a feature of our broader movement politics, despite the problems it perpetuates?
Well, I will start in with that. I mean, and I'll give the happy version of identity politics first for transgender people. Like, you have all these different kinds of people who have different relationships to gender, and maybe their gender, everybody's gender non-normative in different ways, like people who think they're born in the wrong body and people who want to deconstruct gender and all this sort of stuff. And so to become legible on the kind of the political scene as a group, it kind of required, I think people thought it required kind of creating this umbrella categories, like, oh, we're all transgender. Transgender is anybody who moves away from the gender they were assigned at birth. So in a kind of numerical way, it makes sense because it's still a pretty tiny percentage of the population, but if you could put everybody under that umbrella, then they could, or we could make ourselves legible in the kind of lexicon of American civil rights discourse of like, here's a group that has suffered discrimination. It shouldn't have discrimination. Like when Obama was president, the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, gave this long speech about transgender people and this long march of justice and the arc of justice and the whole thing about here's this people coming into their own. So that was like the high point of identity politics for transgender people. So it definitely made sense in terms of the tradition, but the tradition itself is all about inclusion into a liberal order. So it's like one of the things that identity politics can never, well, maybe I should never say can never, but has a hard time conceptualizing is class, right? Like that's the one thing that is outside the bounds of proper analysis. Even when, I've been doing advocacy work, and we say, well, this will affect poor trans people. They say, well, we can't talk about money because we're talking about something else. So I think like there's reasons why it kind of got represented as part of a movement. But as Dave's book does a really good job of pointing out, like it's always going to be so partial. It's just going to reproduce everything, but for it's going to reproduce the most normative characteristics of everybody, but for their gender nonconformity.
Yeah, I think that I would say it simply as the problem is money. So what I'm able to show through this archival research is that in the 90s, when what I think was becoming the mainstream trans movement is kicking up, there's a few key figures who are thinking like, okay, well, how do we do this? Like we belong in the gay and lesbian and maybe, we'll include the bisexual people in there too, group that is forming, and how do we make a claim on that political and social space? And a lot of the ideas that ended up winning out were the ones that prioritized behaving in respectable ways. I only have 4 images in the book, and one of them is this membership form for a trans rights organization where I think it's in 1996, and it's like the membership start at $35, which in 1996 I think was a lot of money, right? And go up to $2,000, and that's what you would have to pay in order to be a member of the group. But if we think about this symbolically, that's also what says that you are a member of the group, is being able to pay that money. And they said at the same time, we know that there are trans kids, we know that there are gender nonconforming people, we know that there are people who are incarcerated, and those people living with HIV/AIDS, and we know those people are important, but someone else will take care of them. We need to just do this. And so I think, it's about critical mass, and it's about money, and it's about respectability, and that's how we end up with these movements that are exclusive by their very nature.
Yeah, so picking up on that a little bit from like a slightly different angle, the struggle for rights and equality often contrasts with quests for broader systemic change, which you both addressed it a number of times throughout this conversation. So why do you think a rights and equality frame so often usurps these larger goals in movement spaces? And what might we do to combat this? This is simple questions, right?
Well, I think speaking from the perspective of like just like the T part of the LGBT, like in some sense to like have like a radical politics, one needs to be able to kind of function socially, like bureaucratically, right? So if you're out protesting and like you don't even have the right identity documents, you're going to be even more vulnerable than you were. So there's a certain kind of basic level needs that for recognition that people have. So I do think like, and also just like recognition, like in my book, I have a little bit of I think I prevented it from being edited out. But there's like, you hear a lot from the Williamsburg New Lefty boys who talk about the politics of recognition and like how transgender people trying to get the right sex classification is so boring. And like those dudes with their long bushy beards have never had a problem getting into their Williamsburg bar with their driver's license. Like, so they don't even think about the privilege they move through the world. So there is a certain kind of basic level of recognition that that people want. But I do think that because of all the things Zein talks about in their book, like it gets kind of, all that energy kind of gets turned into like this kind of nonprofit neoliberal rights discourse. But I feel really optimistic about all the stuff that's going on now with the kind of connections that young trans people are making. With like, there's a whole book on transgender Marxism, and the mutual aid movement was like hugely, one of the biggest people in the mutual aid movement is like a radical transgender activist and prison abolition. So I feel like now we're starting to see all these kind of like lateral organizing moves that in my generation just were not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem is, I was born on November 3rd, 1980, which I like to joke is the birth date of neoliberalism. So for my entire life, I've lived in neoliberalism. And what we know about neoliberalism is that it privileges individual responsibility over collective action. And I think that, Paisley, your book talks so well about that. But then on the flip side, Erin, we know from your work that collective action is hard. Like, it's not easy, right? And it takes a lot of just like, time, and the costs are really huge in terms of safety that Paisley was talking about, and we see this all the time with movements. I think to some extent, social media has helped to facilitate movements in ways that are really amazing to see, and we can, I think that it's promising. There's a move there away from rights as a result. But I think at the end of the day, that we're steeped in, at the very least, I mean, it feels kind of hokey right now to say neoliberalism. I mean, there's also like, xenophobia and Trump that is baked into Trumpism that we're contending with in lots of ways, and these far-right power grabs that we are confronting that I think should be really concerning. And I don't know, I mean, time will tell how it will play out. But I think that a lot of times people just go to, but it's about rights, it's about these different rights, and that's easy, that's low-hanging fruit, when again, we need to be thinking about this more collectively.
Right. So another thing that both of your books do is that they both discuss the relationship between the trans movement and the women's movement. And I think they do so in complementary ways. Can you say a little bit more about that for our audience?
Yeah, so I don't talk about the current situation between the trans movement and women's movement, but I do talk about how, like, trans stuff is, in my world, which is small, trans stuff is hip and cool. And one thing that's not hip and cool is feminism, especially second wave feminism. Like, my students think, if they had a picture of second wave feminists, it would be like a trans exclusive radical feminist who was also working for like IBM and doing all the bad stuff. Like, they have the most...
Was that Edie Windsor?
Yeah, that's funny. But they have like this very kind of caricatured idea of what feminism was. But one of the things, like, the trans rights movement and the recognition that transgender people have already is just, we are accidental beneficiaries of the women's movement, because as the state got into the business of treating men and women differently, that lowered the obstacles for transgender people. So that is like a debt that has to be acknowledged. And what's happening now, the attack on trans people, it's targeted, it's terrible, it's bad. But it is also like a little bit of the tail wagging the dog, because it is a way for the right wing to kind of take back some of the gains of feminism. So we need to really kind of think hard. Like, for example, in Texas, the Department of Agriculture, they were trying to be mean to transgender people. They said, so everybody has to dress in clothes associated with their birth sex, because they, it was a memo to all employees. Of course, that's going to target trans people, but it's just going to target everybody, right? So that's saying like women have to wear feminine clothes and men have to wear masculine clothes. So like, we need to kind of like open up these conversations and stop thinking about like feminism as all gender critical turfs or evil second wave Sheryl Sandberg types, and think more about what autonomy based on gender would actually look like.
Yeah, and so part of the project in my book is to trace the ways that certain strands of liberal right feminism mobilized in trans-exclusive ways to assert their rights claims. And they did this in ways that were also explicitly anti-Black. So a lot of writing has been done on Robin Morgan's 1973 speech to the West Coast Lesbian Conference. Feminist Conference, Lesbian Feminist Conference, in which she inaugurated many of the trans-exclusive terms and discourse that resonate through today's politics. And so a lot of times when people try to make sense of this, they say that they were either ignorant about what they were doing or that they were operating in this zero-sum way of thinking about politics. But in Morgan's case and in lots of other cases, it was explicit malice. And so what this scholar, this historian Finn Enck talks about is how Robin Morgan knew that there were going to be questions about her belonging in the movement because she was married to a man. And so she stayed up all night writing this speech that relied on sexist and racist tropes to assert the primacy of or white women as the proper recipients of the liberal feminist movement against who she was casting as interlopers. And she did this in really violent language. She was very explicit about the exclusions that she sought, and she did so, again, through racist and sexist tropes. And so part of the reason that I was really invested in making this argument is that there's a very strange strain in the social sciences currently that is working to recuperate lesbian feminist discourse to say that, no, actually everything was fine, everybody was getting along, and everything was okay. And what I'm doing in this work is I'm actually just taking the words that they used and kind of handing it back to them and saying, I don't know. I mean, it doesn't look like it's okay. The people who are being excluded saying it's not okay, and so here I'm talking about trans women and Black feminists in particular. And so I think it's about trying to also think about the history of those exclusions in order to create a better politics moving forward, because I think that we can't undo those problems in mobilizing and in our politics unless we understand that. And I think that goes some way to rebutting the people in your class who are, viewing feminism as the problem. First of all, there's lots of feminisms, right? And so we need to be really specific about what and who we're talking about when we're taking issue with these different strains of feminist thought.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think a really good example of that is like Robin Morgan gives a speech, and then it is this National Lesbian Conference. Everything with the conference shows up in this publication. Like there's 30 pages of stuff about the conference. And if you read the whole publication from cover to cover, most of it is like not on her side, right? Most of it is trans positive. People voted for the trans woman not to be kicked out. And then what happens is is like Robin Morgan's speech, because she has some kind of publishing venue, that becomes representative of a certain kind of second wave feminism, and the voices of people, women of color, white women, who are actually not being trans exclusive get erased from history. So I like the work of people like, there's like youngish feminists like Sophie Lewis, who are like beyond, they're like Marxist, queer, radical feminists, and they're going back to these texts and saying, look, they were radical in ways they were not radical, and we need to kind of like take what's good, like look at Shulamith Firestone's work, take what's good from it, drop the stuff that's bad from it. But like this idea of like, it's kind of like this idea that like there's been no radical work on gender freedom and gender liberation until like Judith Butler came along. Judith Butler would not agree with that either. So I think it's like a lot of reclaiming work we need to do.
So I think actually we're at about the time for the Q&A. And I also have an additional question, just depending on how that goes. So we'll open it up for the audience, and also online. If you're online, you can ask questions in the Q&A feature. So.
There is a question from the Zoom right now that I could ask while everybody else is kind of building up the courage. So Leslie on Zoom asks, over the past few years, trans people have been used as a political wedge by both major parties. How can we move beyond partisanship in demanding equal rights for the trans community?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key questions. I mean, I think one thing we could do is, if you go to the Movement Advancement Project or the Trans Legislation Tracker, you see all the places that have bad laws, and like the bad laws are in red, and you know it's like it's this map of geographical division. And I think like we need to pay attention to those laws, and they need to be challenged and so on. But we need to not succumb to this red state, blue state logic about where trans people are attacked and where they're not attacked. Because if you just followed those kind of websites, you would think that trans people in New York are living to be 95 and trans people in Alabama are dying at 28. And it's like, in fact, like everybody in the United States, like people are dying younger. There's more and more income inequality. Like literally there are, like most other countries, rates of early death have gone back to normal, but the United States post-COVID keeps plunging. So we need to kind of not succumb to the red state, blue state logic and understand that in red states are red states because of political gerrymandering, but they're not red states because everybody in those states hates transgender people. So I think like the parties in some sense would love us to kind of just stick with that logic, like the Democrats are our saviors and the Republicans are our enemies, and like neither is exactly right. So.
I'll say something now because my question is similar to this one, although I was staring at my students trying to will them to speak. But hi, everybody. So thank you so much for being here at Roosevelt House. I wonder, I was trying to think about, you spoke to a lot of what I wanted to ask you about. Good job, Erin. Around, I guess tying into the last question, around thinking about the next year, thinking about sex panics and wedge issues and grabs going on, and what are and then also like the legislation that is going to happen or may happen and is around abortion rights being pushed onto ballots in a variety of states. And what are the ways that we can take a bunch of the messages that you just talked about, right, in the last half an hour around both like poverty and kind of anti-capitalist thinking, but also different ways of talking about bodily autonomy, right, in that way. And do you think there's a path where we could talk, I don't want to use the word messaging, do you think, what is language that is helpful in this moment, right, about, if we think about the kind of like resentments, the way, I mean, we could think about like what's coming from DeSantis and Trump as like different, I think they're different, right, they seem like they're different tracks, but obviously related. In terms of the ways in which that rage kind of functions. But what you are both speaking to has to do with both of those things. And I'm wondering, what are the ways in which we can use this kind of abortion moment, tying it to what you just said about, you know, feminism, and then talk more about bodily autonomy right now. Like, what do we want to say kind of right now? Although I think you've done, right, the sort of background work here.
I mean, I think that it would be really important to name very explicitly what is happening in politics in the United States, but also globally. And as you were speaking, I mean, I've been kind of distracted over the last month because of what's happening in the Middle East, and I have family that's affected by this, and people I love and care about who are affected by it. And one of the things that is popping into my head is this thing that people keep saying, which is, you know, the people over there would throw you off a building, right, if you were queer or trans in Gaza. And I think that that rhetoric of there are some states that are good and accepting for queer and trans people and others that are not is used to really obscure what is a far-right consolidation of power that seeks to control people's bodies. And they're coming for, you know, they came first for Black people in, you know, 2020 when there were all of these counter-mobilizations where we learned that people's lives were not, you know, valued in the same way. And they turned their attention very explicitly, and actually before that, undocumented people, right? And they've turned now their attentions to trans people and to people who are pregnant. And, you know, I was just talking with someone who was telling me that apparently in the Texas legislature, they've introduced this law that says that if you're pregnant, you cannot travel outside of the state. And here the fear is they want to like prevent people from traveling outside of the state for abortions. This is, I mean, I cannot imagine a more far-right power grab on like the population than that. And it's like, it starts here and it's just gonna amp up. And so I don't have solutions. I think I'm a big fan of creating as many on-ramps to political action as possible. And so if your jam is intersectionality, like go in that way. If you're an anti-capitalist, come in this way. But like we all need to be aware of what's happening right now, again, here and globally, is a far-right power grab that is, I think, really concerning, and that we should all be really worried about.
Yeah, no, I totally agree in terms of the consolidation of the power grab and the stuff that's happening in the South with the idea of you can't leave the state. That's really frightening. I mean, so we're in this moment where like we have to fight this power grab. We have to kind of fight for bodily autonomy, and it's too bad. Because that's like a bad fight to be in. So it makes me sad that like transgender people and people who could be pregnant, the discourse is bodily autonomy. Because what we should be doing is thinking about like, what would it take to flourish, right? What would it take to make decisions about your reproductive life and having children or not having children? It's not bodily autonomy. I mean, bodily autonomy, yes, it's a floor. But we need so much more in terms of like food, shelter, healthcare, good education, all the good stuff. And trans, I think in some sense we're sort of backing into where like a Roe versus Wade discourse of like, oh, we just keep the government off our body, which yes, keep the government off our bodies, but we should be asking for so much more. So we've got to keep alive these like larger ideals of justice, even as we have to fight the rear guard, because then say we win, we're left with like, okay, we got Joe Biden and bodily autonomy, and we still have, the Hyde Amendment, and we need to have a larger vision as well.
Sorry, I can't talk with a mask on. You brought up your students a couple of times. I was wondering, I just like hearing those type of conversations. Like, what type of conversation would you like to elaborate more on? Like conversations you're having with your students, maybe tensions you have with them, biggest points of departure, and if any of them convinced you of anything in that annoying way the children do. I don't.
My students at Fordham are very docile, and so I don't know that I necessarily have this, but potentially.
Yeah. So I teach different students, but I taught today, I had this feminist theory class of graduate students, and I taught about gender abolition. And like, honestly, like I come into gender abolition discourse like a crank, right? I come in there as like, oh, for God's sake. Like we have to like, fight for, wage equity and making sure care work is taken care of. And like, are we really at the moment of gender abolition? And of course, like they're just smarter than I am and more radical, I think. And they're like talking about all the ways in which, that's like we can do both things at once. Like we don't have to like defend these categories to have a politics of justice. So my students are usually pushing me in a more radical direction. I mean, sometimes I adjunct at private places, and that's kind of fascinating because they're super radical on the gender stuff, and then class just doesn't appear in their analysis. So I can go back to being the radical again. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that I teach at Hunter, so I love Hunter students. They're definitely, I think, similar to Paisley's students, where they're definitely not docile in the classroom. We have a lot of fun conversations about identity, and I learn a lot from them every time I teach any queer policy and politics class. So I think actually we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a final question?
Yeah, maybe this can end on a high note. Yeah, I just would love to hear more about like what would it look like if the state really stopped caring about our gender identity, and how can we move towards gender abolition when the state seems so hung up on surveillance and punishment?
I mean, yeah, that's a really good question. It seems like when you start to kind of untangle the state regulation of gender, you get into family policy. Like one of the things I've been thinking about was in my new book project, I want to talk about all the kind of the transgender hot button issues like bathrooms and gender affirming care. And with each of those issues, I'm going to attach it to a boring issue, right? Boring issue, but also important. Like everybody knows about the bans on gender affirming care, but no one no one in my little bubble talks about the lapsing of the child tax credit, which took half the children who are poor out of poverty for 2 years. And then the Republicans, and the Democrats too, sort of, just let it lapse. So I think if you think about families as institutions where care is privatized and gendered labor, or labor care work is gendered, when we start thinking about like what we need to do to move things forward, we gotta kind of get to all those problems as well, rather than just think, oh, we get rid of the bans on gender-affirming care, everything is good for children. That's not enough.
Yeah, and I would say, Paisley's talking about his next project, and so my next project is on the politicization of exogenous hormones and how we have all these different places where exogenous hormones show up, and so factory farming, for example, is a place, and then fertility treatments for people who want to make babies, and then trans people, and yet one of these things is not like the other, and I think pointing out those contradictions, I think, can provide some of the tools that we need to move beyond thinking about gender as the main thing that we're thinking about when we're talking about politics. And that doesn't, that's not abolishing gender at the state level, but I do think that what it does do is flip the focus and says, it's not just trans people who have gender, it's everybody who has a gender. And when a person who is experiencing menopause uses hormone replacement therapy to keep their hair soft and their skin soft and shiny, that's gender confirmation as well, because that's what it means to be a woman for them. And so thinking differently about gender and maybe not getting rid of it entirely, but thinking about, again, how we all have gender in the same way that we all have sexuality. It's just that some are politicized and others aren't.
Great, well, thank you so much. I'm going to close the event now, but I wanted to make a couple of announcements about upcoming events. So this is our last event of the fall. We were going to have an event on book banning in December, but I had a couple of authors who couldn't be there, who can be there in the spring. So we're going to hold the event in the spring, and it's going to be on censorship, freedom of expression, featuring queer and trans authors whose books have faced censorship. So I strongly encourage everyone who can to come to that event. Also, for students that are either online or here in person, our Pride Policy Fellowship is going to come live within the next couple of weeks. And this is a $5,000 stipend for a summer internship on LGBTQ policy issues or a student research project that you're doing. And then we also are going to be holding a Know Your Rights, transgender gender nonconforming Know Your Rights training with the CUNY Law School in April. So I guess before we end, I should thank our panelists. Thank you so much for being here, and our audience. I'd also like to thank Harold Holzer and all of the staff that made this event possible. My program assistant coordinator extraordinaire, Annabella Pritchard, Mac Barrett, our program coordinator, Daniel Culkin, and all of the individuals behind our awesome AV. I feel like we have the best AV at Hunter College for sure. So we have a reception upstairs. Please feel free to join us if you have time, and thank you for coming out.